All right, folks, week 3. This week we are doing 2 cities. We are hitting it hard this week. And so just going to warn you in advance, we are going to go fast. But if you have questions, feel free to always ask them. Those who are joining us online, the presentation is available for download. That way, if you can't see it really good on your computer or on your screen, you can also have it on a printed out at home or load it up at home. But that's available to you. So week 3, we're going to be doing both Smyrna and Pergamum. Pergamum's kind of funny because it's spelt like 4 different ways. It's Pergamon, Bergama, it's a bunch of different things. But for the biblical narrative, it is Pergamum. But before we do that, I want to talk very briefly about the concept of travel and communication in the Roman Empire. I believe I might have showed this map a couple of weeks ago, maybe. This shows the approximate distances between these 7 cities here in Revelation. And as you can see, it's kind of like a little circle. This is the order they're written in, which when you realize that, it seems quite intentional. It's not just a random smattering of things. This is the literal order of Revelation, from Ephesus to Smyrna to Pergamum to Thyatira to Sardis to Philadelphia to Laodicea. And what is interesting, if you notice all of those distances, the highest one of the order is 45. Now it's 95 to Ephesus to Laodicea, but that's the beginning to the last here. But all of them are between 30, or I guess 25 between Sardis and Philadelphia, but 35, 45, that general area. And there is a reason for that. Not only is the topography, but it is because the amount someone could travel reasonably in a day. So these are the estimates that we have of people traveling. If you were a traveler and you were on horseback or you had a carriage, the estimate is that you could travel about 25 to 30 miles a day. But if you were a pedestrian, which, let's be fair, most people were, so when we imagine Paul going on his missionary journeys, we need to use our imagination of him traveling when he's not on a boat, he's on his feet. And a pedestrian could travel about 20 miles on the top end, 15 on the low end. And keep in mind, they are doing this all without the benefit of soled shoes like you and I have. They would have been wearing sandals that would not have had a rigid sole in the same way. I joke about this at home sometimes, that we don't realize that the way we walk is fundamentally different than the way people before our type of shoes walked. We walk where most of us strike our heel and walk. Back then, most people would have hit the balls of their feet first. In many ways, to us, it might have looked like prancing. That's a common discussion in our home because I'm a prancer in our house and my wife is a stomper. And so when she is upstairs, I think, what is happening upstairs? That everything is falling down, but it's just her walking around. So that's a common marital discussion, a little inside baseball in the Smith house. It's either that or my daughter has dropped her piggy bank on the floor for the umpteenth time. So what is interesting about the Roman government is that they did have a reliable postal system, but that system was exclusively for official messages. They were able to use the network of centurions because I can't remember the exact amount, it's 17 to 25 miles, there was always a garrison station along these Roman roads. And so you could very quickly exchange these letters. Now, there are some examples of really urgent messages, people on horseback being able to get 50 miles a day. And because you can hand that off to someone and they can keep going, this could be a message that quickly transmits across the empire if it's really that important. But if you were a private individual and you wanted to convey a message, there were some companies that essentially had some slaves that they would hire out to do this. You could have them, essentially like a private postal service, or in most cases, you would wait till someone you knew was traveling somewhere on business and say, hey, take this letter for me. Now, another interesting aspect of a letter in the ancient world is if you were to deliver a letter on someone's behalf, it is often, if that is an important letter, you are the visual, real presence of that person when the letter is delivered. So if I, Shane, gave you a letter and you took that letter from me, you are me going there. And so in an oral society, it would be, as I dictated this letter to someone, you in many ways would try to recreate the tone and tenor of my performance in the dictation or how I want it read. So if you think about that in the context of the Gospels, Paul writes a letter to the church in Colossae. More than likely, it's dictated, or this is something he's worked out over time and dictated in a single setting. Many people think it's a sermon, but the person that would have delivered that letter, because it wasn't Paul, the person delivered that letter, more than likely would have been coached by Paul of how to say that letter out loud. Isn't that kind of interesting? And so that's a little bit of knowledge there about sort of traveling communication. Turkey is a lot of up and down, but there are lots of valleys, and so the road system was pretty great. It might not be straight lines, but you weren't necessarily doing like switchbacks on mountains to get places. It would have been, you would have had ups and downs, but they would have been gradual over time, but it still would have been rugged and hot at times, and certainly dangers of volcanoes and all sorts of other things and earthquakes in that area. So this week, we're going to talk first about Smyrna. Now, Smyrna, if you were to go to modern day Smyrna, there's a map. It's that little thing right there in the middle of everything. It is in the middle of Metro Izmir, which is a really large modern city with high rises because it's kind of a vacation spot. It's there on the water. And so there's not a lot of Smyrna left. There is the historical area, which is about a block and a half of the city. There's some other dig areas, but it's not as robust as, Ephesus. Nothing is as robust as Ephesus. But Smyrna is especially small. Now, it is not the worst. The worst is Philadelphia, and we get there. But Smyrna is in modern day Izmir. It was established in the 11th century by the Aeolians. In 600 BC, the Lydian king Aeates destroys it, reduces it to the size of a village, and eventually it was moved. I can't remember exactly where it was moved, but eventually it was moved to this area just below. This is called Mount Pagos. Mount Pagos was called the crown of the city, or the velvet crown. And this is where the city was ultimately located and where its remains are found today. There's stuff on every side of it, but the main area is just below it here towards the sea. In 334, Alexander the Great is credited as being the person who refounded the city because legend says he had a dream about the city. And his dream was to see a city rebuilt underneath or at the footsteps of Mount Pagos. It's about 40 miles from Ephesus, 35, 40 miles, depending on how you go. It is known for its beauty. In fact, someone wrote something about it on some coins. There are some coins that we've actually found that say Smyrna, first of Asia in beauty and in size. Now, the funny thing is, it's not the only city that says that. Ephesus has coins that look exactly like that say the same thing, and so does Pergamum. It has 2 harbors. It is the first city in all of Asia to get a cult to Rome, meaning a temple to the goddess Roma, the patron god of Rome. That's in 195 BC. In 26 AD, there were 11 cities that were vying to become the temple keeper, which is called the Neocorus, for Asia's second imperial cult temple, which means the temple to Julius Caesar or Caesar Augustus. Smyrna wins it and builds a temple ultimately to Tiberius, one of the emperors there at the beginning. But we've not found that temple yet. We just have records that say it was there. It had a temple to the goddess Nemesis, the divine god of retribution. And at its peak population, it was a pretty big city of a population around of 100,000. So a very sizable city, and obviously being on a port would have been significant to it. After Paul left Ephesus, after the riot that we had talked about last week, where the silversmiths got mad at him for criticizing them and making these small Artemis statues, and they threw a riot and shouted in the theater, Paul probably took the road north and ended up in Smyrna. Interesting, the Greek name here is associated with and is spelled exactly like myrrh, which is a spice that they use to wrap dead bodies in order to accelerate the decay process after death. And so Smyrna, because it had such a similar name to that, became associated with death. This is, and it also has a connection to, because some of the most high-profile martyrs of the early church happened in Smyrna. One of which is Ignatius. Ignatius was a bishop of Antioch in Syria. He stopped in Smyrna on his way to being transported to Rome for his execution ultimately in 107 AD. That's where Ignatius met with fellow Christian leaders and wrote letters to several congregations that we have. Later during his journey, he sent a letter back to the church in Smyrna to their bishop by a guy by the name of Polycarp. And Polycarp's a really important figure in the ancient church. He was executed in 156 AD. He was the bishop of Smyrna, and he died at the ripe old age of 86 for refusing to renounce his faith and pinch spice as an act of worship to the emperor. So they took him to a stadium. They tried to burn him, but as the legend goes, the fire did not consume him. Very much shades of the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story from Daniel. And ultimately, they had to stab him. So when they brought him into the city, one of the accusations against him was one of the accusations lofted against early Christians, where early Christians were called atheists. Have you ever heard that before? They were called atheists. And the rationale is because they did not believe in the pantheon of gods. You didn't believe in Zeus, you didn't believe in Artemis, didn't believe in Apollo. Because you did not believe in those gods, it was belief by the Romans and the Greeks that you didn't believe in God, and so they called you an atheist. And so when the proconsul of the region brought him in and said to him, Polycarp, I want you to declare, away with the atheist, basically saying to his own Christian community, away with the atheist, I cast them out. But instead, in an act of just sort of sly humor, Polycarp turned and looked at the crowd in the stadium and pointed to everyone and said, away with the atheist, to all the Romans and folks gathered there. He was told to curse Christ. He didn't. He has this really famous quote in Christian history that says, for 86 years I have been his servant, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? That's a really, really well-known quote throughout church history, and that is attributed to Polycarp there when he's about to die in that stadium. It's known for Cicero. Cicero talked about it. He said it was the city of the most faithful and ancient allies of Greek and Rome, known for athletic games, known for its beauty, known for its beautiful women. It's the home city of Homer. And as you can see, there's not a lot that remains because it's just covered in buildings as this popular area and beautiful area of Turkey just grew up. There was a temple of Athena that was built there in 640 BC. We have a little bit of that remaining. There was a theater at one point that said about 16,000 people. There's a stadium, but again, it's covered by modern buildings. The main site that can be visited is the Agora, which is what you can see parts of here with these arches and this grassy area. There on the far left, that hill with the flag on top there, that is Mount Pagu. That's a very funny thing where they call about everything a mount. You know, compared to the mounts around it, Mount Pagu is not that big, but for whatever reason, it captivated Alexander the Great in a dream, and that's why he refounded the city there. Let's see, they found some, I think this is really interesting. They found some ancient graffiti there in these tunnels underneath, in these archways. And there's this one that says, I love the girl whose number is 1,308. So this is an example of something called isopsephism. Isopsephism. And it is, you take the sum value of each number and you add them together, and that reveals a name. And how can you do this? Why? Because Greek numerals equal numbers. So if you were to write your name using a Greek alphabet, and then you were to add those numbers up together, your name would have a number. So what's funny is they add these numbers up and they just sort of guess, because it's not exact, obviously, because there could be multiple ways to get to a single number, which is actually a funny Christian tradition. The word kurios, which we translate Lord, and the word pistis, which the word we translate as faith, both add up to 800. So you could say 800 as a reference to both Lord, which is the term we use for Jesus, or faith. But that one, I love a girl whose number is 1,308. As best we can guess, it's a boy that was in love with a girl named TK. So why this is interesting is because when you talk about the book of Revelation, and specifically in the 13th chapter, there's this verse that goes like this. This calls for wisdom. Let anyone with understanding calculate the number of the beast. For it is the number for a person, and its number is 666. We've all heard that before. 666, the number for the beast. And if you add up Neron Kaiser which is Caesar Nero, you get 666. That's why every scholar believes that the mark of the beast, the number of the beast, is just a reference to Nero. Nero was the crazy Caesar who ruled in October of 54 to June of 68. He is one of the first major persecutors of the church because he got drunk and crazy and burnt down half of Rome and then blamed it on Christians. And so that's just an interesting thing people did back there. Funny thing with numbers and names. But that's how, if anybody wants to tell you what 666 is a reference to something else, now you know better. It is Nero. So the outline of the message to Smyrna is very much the same as the others. What is different about Smyrna is there's nothing but praise. John has Jesus saying nothing but good things about Smyrna's faithfulness. There is some trouble coming, but they are still acting faithfully. And so let's look here and read the word to the angel in the church of Smyrna. And this comes from Revelation 2, 8 through 11. This is one of the shorter ones. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last who is dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, and even though you are rich, I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison so that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. So this is one of the two churches that is just straight positive. It's free of criticism. It's only praise, warning, and encouragement. And even though Smyrna was known as an especially prosperous city, it seems that the early church there in Smyrna was not rich. It didn't share in that wealth, and we don't exactly know why. It could be simply that participation in something like the church would have meant less economic opportunities because of a lower social status, because you're in a sort of a fringe group. It could have been a direct result of persecution, not being able to participate in certain marketplaces because of those same reasons. Another reason could just simply be that the church has always been a place that tends to attract the poor because it offers, in many ways, more good news to poor than it does the rich. But for whatever reason, they live in a rich city, but they suffer through affliction and poverty. And the major problem that is facing the church seems to be some antagonism that's coming from the Jewish population of the city. And it indicates that the antagonism here is quite severe. And violence in the church particularly continued in this area all the way through the 2nd century. In the martyrdom of Polycarp that we talked about earlier, that bishop of Smyrna, the one who was killed in 86 there in the stadium, we know that the Jews of Smyrna joined their neighbors in cheering for the death of Polycarp and are told to have helped gather the wood to try to contribute to his execution. And so what we need to understand is this harsh attack on the synagogue there and the Jews is specific to Smyrna. This should not be construed in any way as an overall attack on Jews in general. This is specific to Smyrna. So why could this be the case? Jews persecuting Christians. In the eyes of the Roman government and most of the populace at large, Jews and Christians were seen as being belonging to the same group. So Judaism had special legal protection as a religion from Rome. And Christians, as long as they were thought to be a part of Judaism, enjoyed the privileges, that protection. But it appears something happened in the synagogue here, that the synagogue expelled the Christians and viewed them as non-Jews. They might have even turned the Christians over to the authority, saying, these people that claim to be a part of our synagogue are not. These people, these followers of the way, these Christians, are not Jews and therefore should not get the same protections as us. Therefore, It made these early Christians vulnerable to persecution. And that's how you get Jesus here from John in the Revelation calling the synagogue of Satan, because Satan is just a generic term for adversary. An adversary, a synagogue full of adversaries. But what's interesting is John also doesn't see this time of tribulation, this time of suffering, as being worthless. He sees it in many ways as a constructive time, a time for testing and for growing. And that's always been something people have observed about the church. There's a paradox within the history of Christianity. In times of persecution is oftentimes when you find the church being the most creative, the most vibrant, and the most growing. But when a church gets itself in comfortable positions is often when you find a church that becomes, people become less committed to their faith or less connected to the community. And that's a really interesting paradox, especially here in the United States, as certain streams of the church tend to, shall I say, invent ways that the church is being persecuted, even though it's not in the same way. So I think that's a really important thing to point out here. When we talk about persecution here in this, we're literally talking about people losing their life, completely losing their ability to conduct business, losing citizenship, being subject to imprisonment and death. And so in the U.S., most oftentimes when Christians in the U.S. want to talk about persecution here, in most cases, all we're talking about is simply a loss of privilege, not necessarily any legal things, because of course we know in our society you cannot make legal prejudicial decisions against religions. And so I think that's a really important thing to do. Because there are many right now that would be very, very quick to say, oh, the church is under attack in the United States or in the West. And I do think that, I think there's a part of some Christians that think they need to pitch that narrative because it strengthens the church. In some people's minds it does. It steels people for the fight ahead. I just don't think it's honest with what's going on in the history of the church. Anything that we would do, anything that a Christian would do, from speaking about their faith to sharing the good news of Jesus Christ to attending worship, is completely free to do here in the United States. That's not the same that would have experienced here, and that's clear. That's clear, and we will see that when we get into Pergamum. We see that there are people being thrown in jail. I like the interpretation that people live in poverty because their faith affected their ability to pursue work. I think that's true because as we get to Thyatira, we will see that as 100% true. But Jesus goes on in this letter to the angel to use some imagery. And I'm about to show you something. This is 100% a real thing. Ashley thought this was fake when I showed it to her when we got back. These are real crowns that are in the museum in Istanbul. Beautiful. I mean, just beautiful things. And there's language in there that talks about, did you catch it? The crown of life. The conquerors will get the crown of life. Crowns were a really common thing back there. Now, these are fancy, fancy crowns because these are gold foiled and shaped that way. They're awarded to victors of athletic competitions, of people that won military victories, but politicians and priests would wear them in processionals, important occasions. But they weren't always made of gold. They might have just been made of twigs and things like that, twigs and branches as well, or the common things you would see a Caesar wearing. But these are obviously the higher end ones of those. Brides wore crowns at their weddings, as did often guests at wedding feasts. You go to a wedding, wear a crown. That was kind of a thing back then. They were signs of joy, respect, honor, victory. They were made of ivy and laurel and olive and oak leaves. They were elaborate, gold, precious stones. And so the crown of life promised to the faithful in Smyrna, I think, is helpful to be understood as the victor's crown. So there's that language we talked about last week in Ephesians, conquerors. That's that eschatological, apocalyptic language for those who endure the persecution, endure the suffering, and stay faithful. And so the crown of life is that prize for those, that eternal life, the symbol of eternal life for those who endure. And then there's the reference to second death. Second death is the escape. Escaping the second death means escaping the exclusion from the kingdom of God. Those who do not enter the kingdom of God suffer a second death. And so that reward, escape from the second death, is a reference that you will be a part of the kingdom of God. To me, the story of Smyrna, the church in Smyrna, says that faithfulness always requires courage. One of the challenges of the churches, and we will see a thread going out, is understanding where can one compromise and can one compromise in the early church. And so every point in that, every stage in life required a degree of courage. One didn't begin worshiping a whole new God willy-nilly. One didn't say, Caesar is not God, Zeus is not God, but Jesus Christ is God. You don't do that just on a whim. Every single thing you did, because it could cost you. It could cost you your life, your livelihood, your family, your ability to just survive as a family. It cost you friends. It cost you all of those things potentially in order to follow Jesus. And so we see here in the example of Smyrna a community that is doing that to the best of their ability. But it's costing them poverty. It is costing them this suffering that's coming up for 10 days. Now, that would be interesting. 10 days is really specific. And I'm curious what that's a reference to, if there was some sort of referendum or edict that says, we're going to sweep up the Christians and imprison them for 10 days. We don't know. We don't have any evidence of what that might specifically be a reference to. But that's that. That's Smyrna. That's one of those ones we don't have as much on. But then we're going to move on to Pergamum. And Pergamum is one that we have a lot on. It was settled in the 8th century BC. It changed hands a bunch of times, but it was always viewed as an incredibly important city. If you remember, we've talked about it. It's a capital city. Think of it, Washington, D.C. It's powerful. It's wealthy. This is where the movers and shakers live, because this was the capital of the Attalid Empire. This was the seat of power for the Roman governor in that area. It was 45 miles north of Smyrna. It was this natural fortress that was raised up 1,300 feet above the valley below. So on the picture there on the left, the city is actually on top of that hill up there. So it's really far away. I just wanted to show you this. And right here, this is an artist's rendering of what it may have looked like. And this right here is an aerial view of the top of the city. It's high enough that they actually built like a one of those enclosed ski lift type things to take you to the top, because it is a ways up there. Obviously, it makes sense that people chose that because it serves as a natural fortress. If you were going to build a strong empire, it makes sense to be up top. It's a large area. That's where they did it. The Salinius rivers to the west, the Celtius rivers to the east, and after Alexander the Great dies, Lysimachus gains control of Western Asia, and he takes all of his fortune and he puts it in the citadel there at the top of Pergamum. But eventually the Seleucids from Syria come and invade, and in 282 Pergamum switches hands. It goes back and forth, and eventually it ends up becoming the capital of the Attalid Empire, and that's who we've talked about a bunch over the last couple weeks. In 212 BC, Attalus I makes an alliance with Rome, and thus gives Pergamum control of all of Asia in the Treaty of Apamea in 188 BC. But then one of the followers, one of the following kings, Attalus III, a couple generations later in 133 BC, does something really strange. He just gives his entire kingdom back to Rome. We've talked about that one before. The ancient historian Pliny the Elder calls Pergamum the most famous place in all of Asia. This is the most important city. This and Ephesus are always vying for it. And as Pergamum was the king dog for years and years and years, around the time of Christ, they're getting closer to even. And then as we go forward, Ephesus raises in power until Ephesus eventually no longer becomes a port. But it makes sense that Ephesus will rise in power, because as trade grows and the larger Roman world connects, having access to a port is more important. But it makes sense because of Pergamum's location. It's incredibly safe, but it's also connected to a very fertile valley. It has 4 patron deities, not 1, not 2. It has 4. Zeus, Athena. Zeus, the god of lightning and thunder. Athena is the goddess of wisdom. Yep. How about Dionysus? Do you know the god Dionysus, what he's the god of? The god of theater, the god of wine and pleasure. Yeah, Asclepius, the son of Apollo, is the god of healing. And in 29 BC, we've talked about this before, the first emperor cult temple in Asia was built, the Temple of Rome and a temple to Augustus. This is where this idea that the worship of Roma, the deity, is now synonymous with the emperor, the son of God, Caesar Augustus. And so in 29 BC is when the first one in all of Asia is built, and people really buy into it. They love it, and it's built here in Pergamum. What's interesting is we talked about the Jewish presence, the synagogue of Satan in Smyrna, but a lot of archaeological evidence suggests that the Jewish presence in Pergamum for some reason was small. I don't know why, but that's just what we found. Antipas, a church leader, was martyred in Pergamum. We'll see that in the letter in a bit. As I said, the Roman governor, the one who ruled all of Asia, set in Pergamum and exercised something, had a really unique arrangement with Rome. So Rome had this thing that if someone had committed a capital offense, an offense that was worthy of death, that decision on life and death was not made at a local level. You had to go all the way to Rome to appeal that. So we talked about St. Ignatius earlier. He had the bishop and saint out of Antioch in Syria was sentenced to death, and he had to travel all the way to Rome to appeal it. We also see that with Paul. Paul goes all the way to Rome to appeal the things against him. But the proconsul, the governor in Pergamum, had something called uis gladii, which meant the right of the sword, which meant that in his providence, the providence of Asia, he possessed ultimate imperium, meaning absolute power. So he had the right to execute, to kill as he saw fit. That was unique, because normally that was reserved for just the emperor, but not in Pergamum. He had the right of the sword, which is an idiom that means he has ultimate power in that region. So another amazing thing about Pergamum is it had 7 different water lines running to it, and the longest of which ran from 26 miles away from Mount Pendasus. And this is actually on the lower left here is an image of 3 clay lines of water running all the way from 26 miles away at Pendasus. They all eventually arrived at a siphon system, which you actually see a mock-up of right here. That was just, you have a 1,300-foot high upper city Acropolis where it is. You got to get water up there somehow. So the geniuses at Pergamum learned how to do a siphon system, and this siphon right here you see is 2 miles long, and it is 623 deep, and it rose to the top of the citadel in a single lead pipe that had 19 times the atmospheric pressure in it, which is the equivalent of a modern steam pipe. So Pergamum had a lead pipe that was the equivalent of a modern steam pipe, and it put out 6 million gallons of water over the course of a day. It's just dumping water into the city at an enormous pressure because they're able to move water from such enormous distances. Siphons were Attalid technology, aqueducts were Roman technology, and this is where they met. The use of aqueducts and siphons enabled Pergamum, the city 1,300 foot up on a cliff, enabled to have constant fresh water running to it. So we talked about that upper city. What's very funny is all that water is going to the upper city, but no one really lives up there because that's where there are 2 palaces. That's where the arsenal is, the barrack is, the defense tower, one of the agoras. There's the temple to Athena. And so here is just an artist's rendition of what it might look like. Because right now, obviously, it's just ruins. The thing you can probably most identify from things is either the Trajan Temple and obviously the theater. It's the steepest theater in the ancient world. We'll talk about that in a little bit. At the very, very, very top is the temple to Trajan, the Emperor Trajan. It's the only Roman structure on the Acropolis. Everything else is Greek or earlier. This is the 4th imperial structure. So we talk about those temples. This is the 4th one in all of Asia. What's interesting is when Herod the Great is rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, He actually borrowed construction techniques from Pergamum to build, that Pergamum used to build this Acropolis, and specifically Herod the Great used these construction techniques of these arches in Pergamum in order to rebuild up the Temple Mount. So that's kind of a neat connection. This is the Temple of Trajan when you're at the top. This is a bust that's up there that shows you what a typical, I mean, it's still there. It's what a typical Roman centurion garment would look like. And these are actually, these arches are actually underneath this, off to the sides. I mean, it's a really remarkable and huge place. This here is what I said is the theater. It is the steepest theater in the ancient world. It was built in 3 BC. It's huge, held 10,000 people. It had 80 rows. It was 111 feet tall, and it featured a portable stage. It's kind of wild. There's these square holes in the ground at the bottom, and it enables them to have a portable stage because you can see that road right there would have run right through the stage, but what you can't see very well right down here is the temple to Dionysus. So it makes sense. Dionysus is the god of partying, the god of the theater. So you put Dionysus' temple right next to the theater. But if the theater's not in session, people need to get to the temple. You got to get that stage out of there. So that's some pretty cool ancient engineering. We said last week that Pergamum had a famous library, and I've labeled it here. It's right here behind the Athenian temple. It's kind of shaped like an L. It was the second largest library in the world. It was established by Eumenes II, one of the Attalid kings, and it held 200,000 volumes. There was actually a rivalry in the ancient world for parchment, what people wrote on between Pergamum and Alexandria. It was like, it's like the world we live in now where everyone's fighting over to get the best computer chips to put in cars or all the different things computer chips are going into. That's what was happening back then. Everyone was fighting over where to get the best parchment from. Eventually Pergamum started making their own parchment, and they kind of became the people that all of Rome relied on to get their parchment. This is an enormous, impressive library. Another one of the really most impressive things about it is the altar to Zeus. That Eumenes II that built the library also built this altar to Zeus. It was the second largest altar in antiquity. And you can see here on the left, it's our group walking down to it. This is all that remains of it, but not because it's destroyed. This is one of the sad things about the ancient world. If you've ever been to many British archaeological museums, you realize that half the stuff in there is not from Britain. This was kind of the same, except Germans did this one. The first excavators of Pergamum were German, a guy named Karl Humann. He removed the altar and took it to Berlin in 1978 to 1986. So as I said, here it is. You can see it. They reassembled it, and you can go visit it today. It's enormous, and it's in the Pergamum Museum there in Germany. Second largest altar in antiquity, 121 feet by 11 feet. The actual largest was in Syracuse, reconstructed there in this museum. Here's an artist's rendition that kind of shows what it would look like, how it sits there in the Acropolis. It's that horseshoe shape. In the middle is the actual altar where they would have burnt incense and things like that. And so this incense would have raised up, and you can see it there. They did a really nice job in the rendering. You can see the burntness of the incense and whatever was offered wafting up. And the fact that this was on the very top in the Acropolis, the high portion of the city, you would have been able to see this from everywhere around. And if you would have been around, you would have more than likely smelled it. And so the presence of the Zeus altar would have been all over the city, even when you ended up into the lower city. So this is an image of what the larger city would look like. And you can see all the way up here would have been where the Zeus temple was. So if you could imagine yourself down there, it would have not been hard to see that smoke of that altar wafting up. And as you got closer to it, you would have smelt it. It's a really big deal, obviously. I wish it was still there because it would be even more impressive instead of just a pile of boulders and a couple trees, you know. So across the Salinius Valley, and this right here is the Salinius Valley, the valley between these two hills, we get to this area called the Asclepion. It is the healing sanctuary of Asclepius. Asclepius is the god of healing. Asclepius is often called Soter, which means savior. and it is where we get our symbol for medicine. So Asclepius has the staff with the snake around it. That's where we get it. Now, here's the funny thing. There are some places that use this right here. The one on the left, that is not Asclepius's staff. That is the caduceus, which is what Hermes carries. Hermes is the god of trade and commerce. And so the irony is there are some medical companies and medical associations that use this as their symbol, but it is not correct. This is the symbol for Asclepius. I was trying to find out which ones, like Blue Cross Blue Shield uses the correct one, but there are some other organizations, and it's actually been a very big point of contention among some medical communities for people saying, you're using the wrong symbol. But it was a mistake people had made years ago, and as we learn with mistakes like that, they're hard to undo. This was the second most famous healing sanctuary in the world, behind one in Greece, and it was built around this sacred spring. So there on the map, if you look right there, that number 6 and 7 is kind of where the spring comes up there on the left of the map. And I'm going to go back 2 pictures. So this right here is the rendition of the Asclepius, right here. And you can see the spring there in the middle. This round area right here on the bottom right is what the hospital would have been. But the whole complex was meant for healing and restoration. I'll go back to the map here where you can see it's number 9 and 10. 10 would have probably been more like administrative stuff, but 9 was the hospital. You see these little additional round coves around it. That's what you see right here. Right here on the ceiling is a hole in the ceiling. We'll talk about that in a little bit, which is interesting. Coming out for number 9, you see this long channel right here. It is what we are walking through right here. There's actually water running down the side of it. It's just a tunnel that goes down into the hospital. I don't know why they did that. It's really neat though. You go down these stairs, you go underground, and then you end up in the hospital. They had everything here. It was beautiful. This image right here, I'm trying to recreate. This is this street right here. This right here is that street that's looking up at the hill, and that is what you see right here. Number 4 right here is a library, just a small little library that you can read and relax. Number 5 is a theater. Now you would think a theater in a hospital like that would be there to train other doctors, and it certainly did that, but it was literally there to put on plays. Because they really, there is a method to this. It makes sense that if you are sick and want to be healing, providing that sort of comfort and relaxation is going to do anyone good. So what happens, you go down in this tunnel, and you would ultimately end up in one of those little circles. And the technician or the priest of Asclepius, the physician that would be seeing you, would actually speak from another room, and the voice would come out of that hole. And you can still do it this day. The guy that was leading our tour there went into the room, and all of a sudden we heard his voice clear as day coming from the hole in the sky. You don't know if that is, they did that because they knew not to be close to some people. They might have done that because, frankly, it's an act of theatricality, because they are acting on behalf of a god doing some healing. But it's interesting. There are all over the ancient world fantastical stories of healing that happened there in the Asclepium. There's some where people would go into this room. There was a story of a man that went in and had a spear through him. Went in there and he went in the room. They gave him some herbs. He went to sleep, woke up, the spear was out without a scar. That's one of those stories that gets passed around. So Pergamum is a seat of power. It's the most powerful place. It's where the governor was, the governor that had the right of the sword, meaning the absolute power to conduct capital punishment, to kill people. It had extreme power, extreme influence. It had 4 major temples. All those temples up there were visible for miles, including that altar to Zeus that could be seen and smelt everywhere. So just like the other ones, it's the same pattern, except this one, there's actually going to be some criticism in this one, so it's a little bit longer in the letter. And so let's look at the letter, and I want you to think about all the stuff we just learned about Pergamum, and I think you're going to start seeing things pop out in this letter. This is where these letters start getting a little different. So, all right, here we go. To the angel of the church in Pergamum write, these are the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know where you are living, where Satan's throne is, yet you are holding fast to my name, and you did not deny your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you, where Satan lives. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the people of Israel, so that they would eat food sacrificed to idols and engage in sexual immorality. So you also have some who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Now, we talked about them last week. That was mentioned last week in Ephesus. Repent then. If not, I will come to you soon and wage war against them with the sword of my mouth. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. To everyone who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give a white stone, and on the white stone is written a new name that no one knows except the one who receives it. All right. So let's talk a little bit. What jumps out to you reading this that says, oh, they could be talking about this? What do you think?
Satan has a throne. That seems like that would be Zeus's.
Okay.
Maybe.
Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. What about before that? What could be happening before that? We'll get to the Satan throne. These are the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. So most scholars believe this is a direct reference to that unique relationship that the governor of Asia has, the right of the sword. And so what this is saying is, in many ways, these are the words of the person who actually has ultimate power. So you might think the governor here in Pergamum has the right of the sword and therefore has ultimate power, but this letter, these are the words of the one that actually has ultimate power. So if you were someone back then, you would have known the governor of this region having the right of the sword. And so this language is an intentional, just put it in your face. You got to choose one. You got to choose Jesus or Rome. Put it right in your face. Now, move on there. I know where you are living, where Satan's throne is. Now, there's no universal agreement on what is Satan's throne. To me, I think I agree with you, Linda. I think the altar to Zeus is the most plausible one because altars are literal thrones. That's why altars are shaped that way. They're supposed to be thrones. And I think if you look at the rest of the language of Revelation, there's lots of reference to the throne room and the altar having incense and the sweet fragrance of the martyrs. To me, that is the most logical one. But if we think about people who are adversaries to God's kingdom or institutions that are adversary, this city has a lot of them. So there's the altar to Zeus. That's one. It could be because Pergamum is a city of imperial worship. It's the place that wants to build the most emperor temples. It's got one to Roma, it's got one to Augustus, it's got one to Trajan, it's got one to Tiberius. It has these temples, and it could be a reference to that. It could be a reference just simply what we talked about, that this is the seat of power for Rome. This is where the Roman governor would have had his seat of power with the right of the sword. It could be reference to the Asclepion, whose symbol is the snake, because Satan and snake, there's always been that biblical connection there. It could just simply allude to the Acropolis, that large tower that was above the city, where all those things, it could be basically all the above, could be the answer. And honestly, I think every single one of those is probably a perfectly valid way to interpret. I think for me, if I was a Christian then and I would have heard throne of Satan, I probably would have thought of the Zeus temple just because of its size and its visibility. But it might have been one where they just saw it as all. I think that's a perfectly valid interpretation as well. Within Pergamum, there were these individuals, as you move through it, that were spreading these false teachings. And this is where you have to know some of your Old Testament stories pretty good to get these references. It says they're spreading the teaching of Balaam. And so this is a reference to Numbers 22 through 24. Balaam was this non-Israelite seer, or we might just call him a prophet. He was enlisted by Balak, the king of Moab, to pronounce a curse on the Israelites. But Balaam refused and instead listened to God and ended up blessing the Israelites instead. Now, that's a little bit odd, isn't it? The criticism to say you're following the teachings of Balaam was like, well, Balaam seemed to do the right thing. But it's funny, if you go a little further, and when you get into chapter 25, one of the things God complains about a lot in the Old Testament is that there are Israelite men having sex with or marrying foreign women. And this starts happening in chapter 25. And they participate in worshiping foreign gods. And what's interesting is, although in chapter 25, Balaam is not associated with those acts, later in Numbers, when you get to chapter 31, he takes the blame for them. So we don't see evidence of Balaam doing this, but for some reason, later in the book of Numbers, he's the one who gets blamed for the Israelites sleeping with foreign women and taking them as their wives and worshiping foreign gods, even though earlier in Numbers, he blessed the Israelites. So that's what this is a reference to. And so the false teachers there in Pergamum were a new manifestation of Balaam, which means that they were leading others to worship other gods by eating food sacrificed to idols and practicing fornication. That's what it says there in verse 14. So let's first talk about the eating meat part of it, all right? Meat that had been ritualistically slaughtered and dedicated to gods was a major problem in the early church. We find this in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, and we find this here. And this meat, even though it was sacrificed and given to another god, was often taken and sold in public markets, and that these markets were often attached to these temples. It was like, well, we'll sacrifice this calf to Zeus, but let's not let this meat go to waste. We'll just take it and do it at the Zeus market. And it was also used at these public feasts that would happen. So the Zeus Day feast, come get your free steak up at the altar to Zeus. Come get your free steak at the altar to Athena. And so these feast and private gatherings, that's where it was. Was it wrong to eat such meat? Because if we look in the Bible, there seems to be at times conflicting answers. Was it actually participating in worshiping other gods simply by eating meat that you bought at the Athenian market, or eating meat that they were handing out free on the street? Paul faced this problem in Corinthians in the 8th through 10th chapter, and his view was kind of nuanced. He said it was permissible because in Paul's mind, these aren't real gods, it's just eating, you're not really worshiping. You could eat this as long as it didn't harm the faith of people that were less mature. But ultimately, he acknowledged it was really dangerous because even though he thought really in the abstract, there's nothing wrong with eating this meat, he really worried that someone eating that meat would confuse someone that's new to the faith. Oh, I thought you were a Christian, yet I saw you eating at that Athenian festival. Oh, it's just me, it's no big deal. Well, the person might not understand that. It takes a while to get that nuance. And so Paul himself offered a lot of nuance in that. Now, when we get to John here in Revelation, John's not near as nuanced. He's less accommodating than Paul. His view is like, this is a grave violation. You do not eat this meat. And so in a persecution setting where the church is under threat, it makes sense. You cannot create accommodations. You cannot take on these practices. You have to be set apart from that. And so some people have tried to say it's the different context because the church wasn't persecuted in Corinth, whereas the church was persecuted in Pergamum. I don't know, but that's one of those things where depends on what era you're talking to Paul. He seems to have conflicting opinion on it. But here, John wants the church to take a rigorous stand. Don't buy this meat, don't eat this meat, don't deal with it. So they're also charged with eating meat sacrificed to idols, but they're also charged with fornication or sexual impurity or immorality. And I think it's important to understand within the context here, they're not actually talking about sex. So certainly, Rome was full of sexual immorality associated with temples, temple prostitution, prostitution in general, rape culture, all these awful, it was a terrible culture for sex. But when the Bible, particularly in contexts like this, is talking about sexual immorality, what he's talking about is religious unfaithfulness. So this is a theme in Exodus, Leviticus, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, a big one in Hosea. Being unfaithful to God is the equivalent of adultery. So John uses sexual imagery here, and this is why I think this interpretation is the correct one. If you read the rest of Revelation, the language about sex is clearly about religious adultery. So within the context of the complaint, it makes sense, right? You are worshiping other gods, just like Balak led those people to do. So again, we had that reference to that heretical group from Ephesus, the Nicolaitans. Scholars debate what this is a reference to. I tried to do some more reading on the week. We just don't know. There's lots of theories, but not a single one of them has enough evidence to say that's it. So, but we have Nicolaitans in Ephesus, and now we have them in Pergamum. And what it seems to indicate is these are people that were more open to the idea of compromise, or more open to the idea of somewhere between this stark choice. They might be the ones that said, look, you can worship Jesus and you can get drunk at the Dionysian feast, because we know it's just wine. Dionysus isn't real. A Nicolaitan would be someone who does that. And so what we see here in the difference is, in Ephesus, the church was diligent saying, get out, kick them out, kick those Nicolaitans out. But in Pergamum, they allowed those people to keep teaching that and permitting that in the church. And so John understands that in a persecution setting, where the church is being targeted and highlighted for persecution, it endangers the faith to have this lax attitude to compromise. So finally, in those last few verses, there's some reference to hidden manna, a white stone with a new name on it. Those all have these apocalyptic end-time meanings. Jewish tradition, remember, manna is what the Israelites received from God in the wilderness. And it was a belief, and this came out of some intertestamental writings, like the book of Baruch, Second Baruch, which is part of the Jewish pseudepigrapha, that in the end times, God's gift of manna would happen again. And that gift of manna would come in the Messianic kingdom, in God's ultimate kingdom, or when the Messiah comes. And so that reference to manna is sort of a tie back into that Jewish tradition, that when the kingdom of heaven comes, we will once again receive manna. It's probably a spiritual blessing, like the crown is a good way to think of it. And in white stones are meant to be in opposition to black stones. And white stones were used by jurors in trials in order to vote for acquittal. So if you were on a jury and you're voting for someone, guilty black stone, white stone. Now think about that. That makes sense within a Christian context. White, symbolism of purity, symbolism of innocence, which those who remain faithful have in Jesus Christ. It's also used as an entrance ticket to plays and banquets, which also makes sense theologically, because it is our entrance, a white stone, our entrance into the kingdom of heaven. Some say that a white stone was an amulet that was used, and it had a secret name on it. This was a part of magic culture, which is a really big deal back then. This area of Turkey was really into magic and mysticism. And the name that was kept secret on it was not revealed. So the idea, a new name, was probably a new name for the faithful, and it was to symbolize this new character and status. God gave you a new name, but it's not a secret name of God, it's your secret name. So it's symbolic of a change of identity. I think that's the weakest of the plausible explanations, because I think the first two are so strong. The idea of acquittal before the final judgment and entrance into that messianic banquet. And we see over and over, if you would continue reading Revelation after this, the color white is all over the place as a symbol of victory. So I think Pergamum is probably the most stark contrast of all the cities because it's a huge city. If you ever go there, it's wonderful. It was my favorite. I think one of my top two of this or Priene or my two favorite places to visit. It's beautiful. It's huge. It's so unique. A lot of the stuff's not very well preserved, but there's so many different things that there's 4 different major temples. There's all these emperor temples. There's the Asclepium is so unique. But when you're there, you realize the enormous contrast. Who really rules? Is it Jesus or is it the gods and is it Caesar? Who has the right to life and death? You have the Asclepian, this place where people went for healing and they call that God Savior. But who's the one who really saves? Is it Asclepius or is it Jesus? Who's the one that truly heals? Is it Asclepius or is it Jesus? Whose altar do we worship? Who sits on that altar? Is it Zeus or is it Jesus? And so from that framework, I think the challenge for us is, and I think this is a hard question, and I don't have a great answer for it, which is, was compromise possible? So in John's viewpoint, no. You had to choose one or the other. If you're going to worship Jesus, you don't mess around with Asclepius. You don't mess around with Zeus, and you don't mess around with all that free food that looks so good. You don't mess around with the theater. You don't worship those gods. You don't worship the emperor. The only person in your life that has power is Jesus. Jesus is the one to heal. That's it. You don't mesh those things up. There's a clear contrast. But we live in a society that's a lot more gray than that. We don't have temples to gods in our life. We might have metaphorical gods, and that's where it gets challenging. What are the gods in our life? And so for us, it could be, I think probably in America, the most obvious one for us is, do we trust in the power of wealth, or do we trust in the power of wealth in Christ? Power can be the same way for that. I think our relationship with entertainment could be examined in that same way.
Relationship with what?
Entertainment. Yeah, how much of our life do we organize and build around entertainment? While we don't have a society that demands the same things as us and the stakes are not the same, you're not going to lose your job, you're not going to lose your life because you didn't pinch incense and worship to an emperor. You're not going to be hauled in the middle of Nissan Stadium and killed because you won't say away with the atheist. Those things aren't going to happen here. And so it changes the stakes of our thing. What can we permit ourselves to do? But what are the things that we should fully separate ourselves? Because the one answer could be the very extreme answer, right? Which is you could take it in the way of Mennonites or the Amish, which will totally withdraw from society in a way. There are many more evangelical or fundamentalist Christians that will do that as well. As Christians will not compromise, which means I won't watch rated R movies, I won't drink a beer, I won't, all these sort of things. But then you can also take it on the other end and become someone who accommodates everything, saying it doesn't really matter, these things I engage because they aren't necessarily satanic, they aren't necessarily attributed to other gods. But here in Pergamum, John sees the answer is clear. The early church, in order to maintain a cohesive faith, in order to be the kingdom of God here on earth, it has to be a clear break. There's no compromise. And I think that's really hard right now. What are the things, what are the areas in our life where we're compromising that we shouldn't? I don't know, because I personally don't spend a lot of my time in my faith thinking that way. I don't think, what am I compromising on and what am I not? That's a challenging view, especially in a culture where our faith doesn't have a lot of negative consequences in our life. Someone to convert to Christianity isn't going to lose their job, isn't going to lose their life. They may lose family depending on the family dynamic. Those things are certainly possible, but the stakes are nowhere near the same as this. And I think that's the challenge for us. I think it's a worthy question, even though our situations are radically different. Our society is not lacking for things with power. It just uses that power differently. It's not as demanding. It doesn't threaten our life, but it still has power in our life. Economics have power in our life. What we do for work or choose to do for work or how we behave in that job says a lot about how we're going to use that power, or the power money has over our life, where we choose to live, and who we choose as neighbors and who we choose to associate with is all reflects those things. And so I think that's the question. If you want a question this week to go home or sit at home or haunt you as you're falling to sleep, I think that's the question is, what are the areas of your life that you are too quick to compromise your faith? And that is Smyrna and Pergamum.
Do you think that it's gotten more difficult?
Has it gotten more difficult?
With,
I think
with
so.
all the entertainment, all
Yeah.
the different things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Certainly I don't want a society like a lot of people seem to want or suggest having a sort of a Christian.
Yeah, a Christian nationalist society. Don't want that.
Nobody, please. However, having said that, when I was a kid, which was a long time ago, the culture supported you in some ways, or my culture did, or whatever. In not worshiping other things.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Or at least it felt more simple.
Sunday,
Yeah.
Your
Sunday
law, your blue laws.
Yeah. Or even simple things for like kids. It's like you're not having to deal with Sunday sports leagues.
Yeah.
Which is a very common thing. It's a very common thing now for parents to be like, well, I really want my kid in soccer, but then I got sports or band or whatever, Yeah, there seemed to be a little more.
You didn't have that. Now, if you were, another faith, but there weren't things to do.
we didn't have those choices.
Yeah, you didn't have any. It was like, this is what you did.
Yes. Yeah.
There was no Titan game at noon.
Yeah, and I think there is a seduction of saying like to me even to take that back a step further, it's like I'm not itching to live in ancient Rome. I'm not itching to do that, but within the context of you study these things, boy, that dividing line between faithful and not to me feels a lot more clear. Because that's why I think these things are interesting, because it sets up a really clear line of like, this is faithfulness, this is not. But to piggyback on what you're saying is you fast forward to now, and we live in an incredibly complicated world. And even our own lifetimes, we can, I feel that way. I'm in my 40s, and I think about that with my childhood. I feel like my childhood was easier, to make those. I didn't have to deal with the internet. We didn't have cable. We just had an antenna that had turned a little knob, and it moved the motor and aimed the antenna where we wanted to watch. And, and that was my entertainment options. And so I got on a bike and ran around my neighborhood with the other neighborhood kids. And that was it. And then fast forward to now, and we all have the ability to have little computers in our pocket that can infinitely distract us. And that's the cultural critic, Neil Postman, has written a lot about some of this. And there's often a comparison between the post-apocalyptic novels of 1984 and Brave New World. And so when something happens, people are like, oh, this is 1984, this is 1984. Well, the story of 1984 is an authoritarian government that tells you what to think and even just forces lies down your throat. That's not the society we live in. We live in the society of Brave New World, which you are so inundated with entertainment and options to, soma, drugs to make you euphoric and feel these things. You are so inundated with entertainment that it makes us forget what it means to be human and connect with one another. That's the danger of our society. And so the phrase some people use is just say we entertain ourselves to death. And so that are we compromising on that? Are we dedicating too much of our lives to entertainment? Yeah. I think of that a lot. Yeah. I think of that. I think of that within like, we there's always been, in our lifetimes, there's always been some form of advertisement, but there's not been advertisement like the way we see it now. Just pay attention on our drives home. If you happen to drive by any places of business, you'll see hundreds of ads everywhere. You pick up a phone. Our brains have learned how to not notice ads as we flick through an article on our phone or on our computer. But then on top of that, they disguise and they sometimes don't look like ads, right?
Right, but then now we don't watch cable TV because who wants to have
ads
in the middle of your program?
Yeah. When Everly, we never had TV when she was little. And we just had Netflix and stuff like that. And so she'd go to grandparents and they'd watch the Disney Channel. And she was so confused what ads were. And so we started telling her, we would just say, they're just trying to trick you. They're just trying to trick you. And so when as a little kid, she goes, I'm not going to be tricked. And she'd say that. But yeah. The part that is crazy too is like, we've dedicated so much psychological research to what motivates people to buy things by creating a sense of scarcity. And then on top of that, all the algorithmic learning that says, you said to a friend while you were traveling you were interested in a new pair of hiking boots, and all of a sudden a week later, hiking boots ads start popping up on your phone.
Scary.
It's so I can't control that. I can't control that algorithm, but I can control, I guess, ways I engage in things that use that. And so am I compromising my faith because I'm not leaving space for God because it's so full of entertainment and consumerism and wealth? I don't know. It's a hard question. I mean, yeah. We can all be monks.
Well, and the whole not causing people to, I went on several years ago on a mission trip to Belize, and we had this guy, the Belizean folks that we were working with, we were gonna have a dinner that night, and of course we were like Presbyterian, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like I got bit by a thing and we were in the bar like that night, I got bit by an insect, and my friend goes, go to these people over here that are in Bible study. They had a doctor and
Okay.
because I had to interrupt their Bible study for this doctor to look at. But the person in charge said, when we meet and have this dinner with these Belizean folks that we were working with on building church, and I worked in the school and worked with the kids and stuff, but like don't drink because they wouldn't understand. We call ourselves Christians, and yet we'll have a glass. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that whole don't be a thorn or whatever it is.
Yeah, don't be a stumbling block.
Yeah,
Don't be
stumbling block. And so it was sort of an interesting, because of their, I mean, we would kind of, I think, not in a humble way, think that we were more mature.
Yeah.
Not,
when you're on that trip,
that was not, I mean, you know how you,
yeah.
we were the saviors and the whole 9 yards, instead of like really examining ourselves and why we were.
One thing that I think is very beneficial, and I have lived in the same place way too long, but I think it's very beneficial when you live in different places, when you live in a rural community and then you live in a city.
Mm-hmm.
Because many times urban people think they are superior to, and this is not the same thing as what you're saying, but similar. We go, oh, they talk like a hick. They talk rural. They don't know as much.
Yeah.
They're not the same kind of person as I am. And then you go, excuse me? No.
Yeah.
No, it's really easy for us to judge something different.
Yeah, and it's next week we'll actually, that dynamic you just talked about, rural versus urban, there's that we pick up on some of that in Sardis, because that's a tale as old as time, the superiority, some people in certain cities thinking they're superior to those living out nowhere or in tiny villages and stuff like that.
New York versus Nashville.
I think some of these lessons are hard to apply because I think the easy thing would be to over apply them, and to we'll talk about Thyatira next week, which picks up on some of these things. The temptation is you could over apply them and just say, what areas am I compromising in my life? And then just try to look at every single area and just find an area where I say I'm compromising. That would be really hard. That would be really easy. That'd be easy. And it might provide a certain degree of certainty, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's right. It's very difficult. Yeah.
I could see if John had a very strict line about what he thought was acceptable.
Yeah.
If theater's not, their culture was so full, and someone comes in and says, sort of like, you can't dance, you can't do this, you can't do that.
Yeah.
And then you are kind of going, I'm not sure I'm interested in that.
Yeah. This is where it's really hard to transpose this too, because you could describe Roman culture in a way that very much sounds like elements of the American culture. A culture of excess, because we will talk about this in Thyatira specifically. There's a culture of debauchery, sexual depravity, and the way the power structure is set up for a family system, whereas a wife or any of those children having no rights, and so that pater familias, the head of that household, has absolute authority to do what he wants, and on top of that is encouraged to do what he wants. And so it's a culture where how do you worship God? You worship God by getting drunk and having sex. And and having sex with young boys, having sex with prostitutes, having sex in that way, and then you gorge yourself on food and make yourself throw up, and then you do it all over again. That's how you worship God. And so, you can talk about that culture of excess. You can talk about the theater that glorifies sex and violence and vulgarity, because that's a big part of theater as well, is the theater vulgaris.
I think I was thinking more. I wasn't thinking about theater
Yeah.
in those lines.
Yeah. Well, but what I'm saying is, I think it's hard to transpose that, because when we look at those things and we can see elements of gluttony, we can see elements of sensationalism in our society. The difference is in that culture, those things were held up as cultural norms, and there were expectations to participate in that. Our society, you could, if you wanted to be someone that just said, I have a blanket policy. I don't see rated R movies because I feel like it could be too sensational. It could be portraying sex in a way I don't think is healthy. It could do all that. So I just have a blanket statement against that. Well, that's fine. That's not going to cost you a job, and that's not going to cost you your life. And because our society is so much more fragmented, even within the church. In the United States, that's when you talk politics in the church is fragmented. Our Presbyterian church is really interesting, because the PCUSA, although it tends to be one of the more progressive churches, where it is on a voting map is just dead down the center. We're just a dead down the center denomination. We have equal amounts of Republicans and Democrats and moderates within our denomination. But then you have other churches that, black churches typically are much more Democratic, whereas you have white evangelical churches, which are hardcore Republican. And so even the church itself has fragmentations on the way it interacts with elements of society. The infinite number of jokes of what's the difference between a Presbyterian and a Baptist. A Presbyterian will say hi to you in the liquor store. Even different attitudes on things like that are represented. And so not only is our society more fragmented, maybe in the ancient world we wouldn't have had social media to help me learn about someone with a totally wildly different belief than me. And so I have my brain that now has to know, I have to know all these beliefs, and then I know about QAnon conspiracy theorist and flat earth conspiracy theorist and someone who believes, it's overwhelming. And so our brains are not meant to process that much information. And so that's why a question like, where are you compromising on, can feel really intimidating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you have did you all read the posthumous, well, it's written by a friend, but the Rachel Held Evans?
Yeah, the book.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Do you know? Yeah. So, it's kind of disconcerting. She's sort of
Yeah.
this fundamentalist, and then sort of saw the light, or how you want to talk about it, and not. But then you think, oh my goodness, is this just too far. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a little bit disconcerting, even
Yeah.
her.
What are the boundaries of this?
What are the
And
boundaries? I mean, you
Yeah.
know, like. It's
yeah,
like
that's a big debate right now within the church based on, there's a term that a lot of people use, they just call it like deconstruction. It's a bit
What?
deconstruction.
Yeah,
There's a lot of, and that's coming out of a more evangelical environment. Of course, I guess she was in that, and ultimately she was worshiping at an Episcopal church, you know.
Yeah, she was really
and-
bad.
and-
I mean, you know, she went to. I think she went to Lee College.
Yeah, Lee down there, yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you know, grew up, of course, in Dayton. I mean,
Yeah, grew up in the Scopes monkey trial
the
town,
Scopes-
yeah.
Scopes monkey trial, and
Yeah.
but apparently she's very, very kind toward her parents.
Yeah, that had to be a complicated
That was kind of an
situation.
interesting thing, because it's like you can grow up in that kind of environment, so to speak,
Yeah,
but then it kind of shows you the value of your own family structure, and they allowed questioning.
yeah, if they allow questioning,
You know,
yeah.
rather than, but
Yeah.
that's the problem with all that, is the
Yeah.
not allowing questioning.
Yeah, and
I mean,
that's,
in my view.
and that's been the criticism, and I think a very fair criticism of a lot of people that are in that deconstructionist movement, where they're coming out of their evangelical faith and deconstructing that faith, is that they were in a system that didn't allow questioning, and all of a sudden that seal breaks and they start questioning, and everything falls apart. And the phrase I've heard for a lot of people is, you know, the answer for bad theology is not no theology. It's good theology. Or the answer for bad faith is not no faith, it's good faith. And I think we find ourselves in a place where you could very easily go from that environment where you weren't allowed to ask questions, you weren't allowed to exhibit doubt, and then it leads you to a place where you feel like the only response is just polar opposites, just not have it. Just not practice that faith instead
I mean,
of
you kinda
instead of
have, 'cause that's
instead
the
of
thing
a
on the days when I believe. I mean, that was the whole
Yeah.
thing of it. She keeps saying that.
In days when I believe,
as
yeah.
if there were days that she didn't. I mean, which is, and then reading about her husband, you know, after
Yeah.
she died, and her husband, you know, I mean, I've read his
yeah.
you know, and he's continued to tweet and so forth, and I mean, it sounds like he doesn't have faith.
Yeah.
I'm
yeah.
not making this, but I mean, he says things like that
Because of her death?
because of her death. And,
Yeah.
And well, I mean, just because of it, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think an important
that was almost frightening to me.
I think an important distinction, because I have some colleagues that'll say that on days I believe and days I don't, or days I doubt. I think an important distinction to hold within that is, particularly if we look at Revelation's a really good example of that, because a lot of Revelation isn't necessarily about belief; it's about practice. And so,
Right.
so I could describe myself in that. I ebb and flow. I don't have a constant level of belief. I don't think I've ever got to a point where I say I don't have belief, but I definitely have days where it's like, oh man, this is a real struggle today. And other days where I'm very much spiritually vibrant.
Well, and her point and her things were these extremely difficult questions.
Yeah.
That she was taught. I mean, that
That you shouldn't ask and you shouldn't. Yeah.
Well, and things like that she did. I mean, basically, her faith taught her that somebody like Anne Frank is like in hell.
Yeah, because of its
I mean,
narrowness.
for lack of a better way to put it.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's very disturbing to people.
What I was going to say, like to relate it to what we're talking about Revelation today, is like what these churches are being commended for is their faithfulness. And faithfulness doesn't mean, in this context, it doesn't mean like, oh, I really get it every day. It's more that like they have the endurance to say, okay, I'm going to stick with the way today. I'm not going to participate in that Dionysian feast. I'm going to be a good neighbor to my neighbor. I'm not going to participate in the food fest with the Zeus. Even on days when belief is little, this is my thought for myself. I pray on days when my faith is little. I still have the strength to do what I think God has called me to do. And I think that's where describing faith as a practice, I think is very helpful, because it's something like, I mean, I think that's why Paul's so fond of athletic metaphors, is because it's something that is never perfected. It's something that is, sharpened and fashioned and
Right.
practiced, and yeah.
Right.